in some circles of Christianity, we sort of try to sanitize Jesus away from politics, but it's clear that the Gospels don't let us do that. In some circles of Christianity, Jesus is like constantly the agitator, but also Jesus actually he's more than that too, right? I mean, he's not just an agitator when the woman is caught in adultery. He is this profound presence of God's caring love. So, I mean, Jesus the guy can read a room, right? I mean, and that you see that over and over in the Gospels. And once I just put that lens on the Gospels, I could just saw, oh yeah, like Jesus is navigating politics all around him.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. Our show is powered by you, the listener. If you want to support the work that we do, get early access to episodes, episode guides, and more, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture to become a monthly patron so that we can continue in this important work. And don't forget to hit the follow button on your favorite podcast app to be notified when new episodes come out each week. And go leave a rating and review. It's easy, it only takes a second, and it helps us find new listeners to the show. Just go to the show page on the app that you're using right now and hit the 5 stars. It really is that easy. Thank you so much. You know what else would help us out? Share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network. Tell them how much you enjoy it and let them know that they should be listening as well. If you're new here, welcome. If you want to dig deeper, find us on social media at Shifting Culture Podcast, where I post video clips and quotes and interact with all of you. Previous guests on the show have included David Fitch, Scott McKnight, and Preston Sprinkle. You can go back, listen to those episodes and more. But today's guest is Ross Kane. Ross Kane teaches ethics and theology at Virginia Theological Seminary, where he also directs their doctoral programs. He's an author and pastor who writes about the complex intersections between theology, ethics, and culture. Politics is a dirty word for a lot of people. We think about strife, conflict, waging war for power. But is there good news in politics? Well, Ross Kane thinks so. In this conversation, we reflect on his latest book, The Good News of Church Politics. Ross discusses how politics is about organizing common life and decision-making in communities large and small. He talks about how Jesus navigated politics skillfully in the Gospels. He also describes how congregations can cultivate politics of love by starting with caring for their own members and moving outward in concentric circles to care for their neighbors and address issues in their wider communities. We focus on practical ways congregations can organize interdependently and engage in bottom-up social change by addressing local injustices. So join us as we discover the good news of church politics. Here is my conversation with Ross Kane. Ross, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thank you for turning on your microphone and being here.
I appreciate the invitation. It's a real pleasure to join you.
Yeah. So Ross, set this up for us. You wrote a book, The Good News of Church Politics. Why this book for you? And can you then, as a start for our conversation, define what you mean by politics?
I wrote the book largely out of serving in a congregation, and this congregation was based outside Washington, D.C., and politics was sort of always on our brain. And when we thought about politics, we thought about national politics. But then there was just something nagging in me that didn't feel right about that. And I was working on my PhD in Christian ethics at the time and was reading a lot of political theology. And there's a lot of work in political theology and African studies and elsewhere that says, look, politics isn't only about the state. Politics is about how we form a common life. It's about how we make community. And that just reorientation in politics helped me become a better pastor in that congregation. It helped me see that, politics isn't only about conflict and strife. It's not only about the will to power, but politics is about how, even in the most ordinary ways, we form common bonds together as people. And I saw, because I was working in a congregation while reading all these books for my PhD, that for Christians, the congregation is that first place where we encounter common life beyond just our own family, right? For Christians, the congregation is the first place where we engage political life. So by politics, to get to the definition that I kind of used throughout the book, politics is the process of sorting out how communities live together and make decisions. And those communities can be very small. I mean, that definition can apply to like an online chat room, or they can be enormous. That definition can apply to the United Nations, right? That's what politics is about, is organizing our common life, sorting out how we make decisions together. And then that just gives us a whole reorientation that enables our congregations to be places where we can start to live out politics. That is actually good news. Like, the title of the book is not completely a joke, right? My tongue isn't entirely in my cheek, because churches can actually be places where we can find good news in politics.
Yeah. And so if our politics in our congregation are there, it's how we organize our common life together, and we're starting to work together. We have some interdependence and love one to another. How does that reflect? So do we stay in the congregation and just organize ourselves, and we're doing a great job here? We have the right kind of politics, but it doesn't really affect the neighborhood, our community, or even the nation or the nations around the world. What are we doing here? Is it just focused right here on the church and the congregation, or does it somehow bleed out into the way that we live, work, and play in our own communities outside of our congregations?
I really like the way you put that. I think of these different realms of politics as really concentric circles, if you will, and that sort of center concentric circle of Christian politics is our congregation. Like, that's the place where we should start in terms of forming a community that is based in love and justice. And so what does that look like? That looks like us caring for one another as a community. That looks like us as a congregation having, something as simple as a coffee hour that's based around welcome and care for everybody who's there, as opposed to sort of, cliques just talking to each other during coffee hour, which of course never happens. But that's sort of that first concentric circle. And you're exactly right. That's what bleeds out. And so the next concentric circle is, to me, the neighborhood around the congregation itself. And I've found in my own ministry as a pastor that if you've got the first circle, then the next one actually comes pretty easily. That congregations who really know how to care for one another and know how to organize their own congregational political life, their own congregational decision-making in ways that reflect God's love. Congregations that can do all that, they work in their wider community fairly easily. It's a pretty natural move for them to go to that sort of next concentric circle of work in the neighborhood. And then, of course, when you get involved in the neighborhood and you encounter the struggles of neighbors, that does take you into city life. So in my own experience, again, one of the main issues that came up for me as a pastor in the neighborhood was how expensive it was to live in this city that was, inside the Washington Beltway, where the price of housing was just skyrocketing. And we saw our neighbors struggling. And you know what? That takes us to that next concentric circle. We have to engage with the city politics. and advocate and be involved in trying to relieve some of the suffering of neighbors through city politics. And so that then becomes kind of that next concentric circle. And then, of course, circles beyond that would be like state politics and national politics and that sort of thing. But I think it's pretty unhealthy as a congregation, to just sort of leapfrog from the congregation to nation state politics. Because I think that kind of engagement can really lack roots, and this might be something to talk more about down the road, but it can get the church really ensconced into politics as partisan rather than politics as, being founded in just loving our neighbors, right?
Yeah. Well, I think that's what the church in America right now is reeling from, is partisan politics, which they are leapfrogging the community into the nation state politics. And what does it look like to, hey, I'm on this team, you're on that team, and it's an ugly division within the church. How can we start to then organize our congregations, our church, around a place where we can have either healthy dialogue and we could love one another, we could see each other and start to work together even when we disagree, even when things aren't the, hey, happy-go-lucky, we could all, serve soup on a Sunday,
That's a huge question, and especially right now in our, wider national political life. The challenge of partisan politics is that partisan politics really encourages us to find enemies instead of learning to live together as neighbors. And so to me, the response is still in that commandment of Jesus to love your neighbor. And that has to be where it all begins. And, I don't have some vision in this book that, people could, congregations can, suddenly be engaged in neighbor love as politics, and, all the Biden supporters and Trump supporters join hands and sing Kumbaya or something like that. Like, it's not simple. At the same time, I do believe that loving neighbors as a congregation in ordinary congregational life is kind of a necessary first step for Christians as we engage in politics. And I do think, you mentioned like serving together in a soup kitchen. I think that there's a lot more to that than we often recognize. I mean, in most of the ministries that I've been a part of in my congregations, we've had Democrats and Republicans like working together, whether it's in the soup kitchen, whether it's in the emergency assistance program. They don't even agree about what the policy should be that addresses this issue. But it's a start. I mean, it's actually a place to begin. And, these our congregations can be places where we can begin to heal some of the divisions of partisanship.
Sometimes this is how we engage political life, is we basically say we're neutral, just go vote whatever you want, do whatever you want. We're just going to talk about Jesus here. But Jesus himself, I don't think is very neutral. He's on the side of the marginalized, the neglected. He's on the side of, a love for neighbor and for all people. He's on the side of justice when there's, injustice issues. How do we start to organize ourselves around what Jesus wants and what he's for, and not just say it's a neutral free-for-all and we're just going to be like not talk about anything and we're going to be okay here together and we're just going to talk about our nice little Jesus stories?
Yeah, I think it has to be that we stand in the place where Jesus stands. Just like you said, we are as Christians on the side of the marginalized. We're on the side of those who are suffering, whether those who are suffering oppression, suffering from, especially in our country, racism and so many of the, historical sins of racism and displacement and other things. And we stand where Jesus stands, and we let the politics emerge from that. But we don't get the politics from the sort of immediate partisan engagement. I mean, I just think it has to be more bottom up than that.
It needs to be bottom up. I think that you have a part in your book. You talk about how Jesus dealt with politics in his own life and ministry and what he was about. Can you give us an example of Jesus engaging in politics and being on the side of love so that it could be a good example for us to move into the church, to go from bottom up?
Hello, I'm Deborah Thayer McLean, the host of Heartfelt Praise, Embracing the Lord's Love podcast. Join me as we explore the Lord's love through stories of redemption and the power of His Word. I share revelations that I've received from Scripture with glimpses of my allegorical novels, Rescued by Love and Redeemed by Love, woven through the episodes. Heartfelt Praise is here to uplift your spirit as we see the Lord's love entwined throughout our lives. Subscribe to Heartfelt Praise today and let your heart be encouraged.
One of the things as I was writing this book that kept surprising me was actually how political some of the most ordinary events in the Gospels really are. There's all these interactions that Jesus has with scribes and Pharisees. And I think, to your earlier question, we've kind of forgotten how political those engagements were. We sort of have scribes and Pharisees there. We sort of imagine them as these largely religious figures of their day. But like religion and politics weren't separated in conceptually in the same way they are for us as Americans and post-separation of church and state, political philosophies and all that kind of stuff, right? I mean, Pharisees and scribes had a lot of political power. And Jesus is engaging them in ways that have such political acumen. And that was the big surprise to me, was just seeing how politically clever Jesus is in the Gospels. You take examples where scribes and Pharisees, you want to arrest Jesus right then and there, but then they see that, there's this big crowd around him. Well, we can't really arrest Jesus in front of this big crowd. So, of course, later in the Gospels, Jesus gets arrested when he's just in his disciples in the garden, right? And, think of when Jesus is asked, by whose authority are you doing these things? Is it John the Baptist or whatever? And he sort of uses John the Baptist as cover, right? I mean, it's really very clever. So Jesus is always kind of upending. He's upending assumptions and surprising his opponents. And at the same time, should I even say opponents? Because look, I mean, in John chapter 3, Nicodemus the Pharisee seeks him out and he says, "You're not," and Jesus doesn't say, "You're my enemy." He just brings him right in and he becomes part of Jesus's movement. And the other thing that's really striking to me in the Gospels about Jesus's political acumen is how, he talks to scribes and Pharisees one way, but then the way that he talks to people who are struggling and suffering, his entire demeanor just changes. How does Jesus treat the woman caught in adultery? He is so kind and so gentle. So, in some circles of Christianity, we sort of try to sanitize Jesus away from politics, but it's clear that the Gospels don't let us do that. In some circles of Christianity, Jesus is constantly the agitator, but also Jesus actually he's more than that too, right? I mean, he's not just an agitator when the woman is caught in adultery. He is this profound presence of God's caring love. So, I mean, Jesus the guy can read a room, right? I mean, and that you see that over and over in the Gospels. And once I just put that lens on the Gospels, I could just saw, oh yeah, like Jesus is navigating politics all around him. And that's again where I think that can really help our congregations, because we see that, Jesus uses all these different strategies, and, pastors and lay leaders, we should too. Like if a situation calls for us to reach out in profound care, the way Jesus reaches out to the woman caught in adultery, that's what we should do. If the situation calls for us to, call out a scribe or a Pharisee, like that's what we should do. But if we can read the Gospels with those lenses, I think it really can help shift our congregational cultures toward a politics of love and care and justice.
When I look at the nation state politics, I think of strife, and I think of power and jockeying for power, and I think of people trying to shield themselves so that they can stay comfortable where they are and not move into something that hurts, that is uncomfortable, because we see someone else suffering and other people suffering. And a lot of times they don't move towards the flourishing of all people. They just want the flourishing of a few people so that they could stay comfortable. How could we help organize around a space where it gets people to say, I'm okay to put aside my comfort for a little while to see the flourishing of someone else or my community or the people around me?
To me, it starts in really that second concentric circle, going back to the concentric circles, right? I mean, that first circle of congregational love and care, and then that second circle where we are encountering neighbors in our congregation. Now, cities and towns are different from each other, right? I mean, the church where I've worked in most of my vocation was, fairly urban. So loving neighbors meant caring for people who just show up at the door and say, look, I can't pay my utility bill. That's the start in a neighborhood like that. And if you're in a suburban area where you don't have a lot of visitors, coming by your church, and, you don't necessarily have neighbors seeking you out, then, it can be more important to step outside of your own neighborhood, because our neighborhoods are profoundly connected to one another, right? And then I think one way to frame the question is, love my neighbor isn't only about loving the neighborhood residents of, around your congregation. It's about loving anybody who is who comes into that neighborhood. So, who are the people who come to work in your neighborhood, be it suburban or urban or rural, who can't actually afford to live there? What does it mean to love them? But to get back to the question you asked, to me, I think it has to be based in encounter. It has to be based in our encounters with people who are struggling and people who are suffering, because I think that's when our own affections get transformed, right? And one of the things that I think is really healthy about congregations is that if they have solid outreach in the community, it becomes a way of sustained encounter. It's not just this sort of encounter that happens here and there, but it's an encounter that you have over and over as a congregation, whether it's through a feeding ministry or some other way, but it's this sustained engagement with the community where we can see and share life with those people who are different from ourselves, those people who are suffering, those people that Jesus has called us to be with and to care for.
So if you're outside of a place where there's a lot of, people coming towards you saying, hey, I can't pay my utility bill here, but then I have to then start to do some research to figure out where is the suffering in my neighborhood? Where's the suffering in my community? Where's the suffering in my city? How can we start to organize around seeing what we actually need to engage, what we actually need to bring the love of God towards, and the reign of God, the kingdom of God, into a place to say, hey, it's operating here. God's kingdom is for all of us. You step into it. There's a new life, and a life that can actually bring about this love and this interdependence within this suffering part of our community. How can we start to organize around a place where we say, oh, this is the thing, this is the place of injustice that we need to stand with, but because I'm over here in my own little silo, I don't actually see it. How can we start to lift our eyes so we can see what we need to engage in as a community?
That's a great question. To me, it really starts with research in your neighborhood and in your community. So to me, I think, again, like it sort of works through a kind of ripple effect, a bit like these concentric circles, right? So, in one congregation I served, this goes back to the housing example, we didn't actually start by having some sort of major campaign that said, oh, look, housing is expensive here. What can we do about it? It started with, a couple of us who worked in this emergency assistance ministry that our congregation had, noticing day after day, or week after week, month after month, year after year, the rent bills that people needed help with were just getting higher and higher and higher. Well, what do you do then? I don't think you actually just jump straight into, okay, clearly we're supposed to advocate for housing affordability. I think actually there's a step before that jump where you research the issue and you start to figure out as a congregation, what are some of the policy dynamics behind this? What are the demographics of this community? Work with other community organizations who have the data generally. I mean, it's not that hard to find if you know where to look. I mean, talk to your health department. I mean, talk about people who have great stats about income level, about, all sorts of, health and disease stats, which often align with, income levels. What are the pockets in your town or city that are especially suffering from poverty? Your health department's going to know a lot about that. If there's a community foundation in your town or city, talk to folks in the community foundation, talk to folks in the nonprofit sector who work in these areas. And in my experience, these folks are delighted to talk to congregations because they're looking for allies too. They often feel really alone in the work that they're doing. So take the time, do that research. Then you have a sense of what your congregation can do and what your congregation can't do. Again, in the housing affordability example, there are certain things that a city council can do in the state where I live, and there are certain things that they cannot do. Housing affordability it's a profoundly local issue. It's also an international issue because you have international conglomerates buying tracts of land in large cities and building huge buildings, and sometimes not even renting out all the units just so they can keep the prices high, right? So it's also an international challenge. But, a congregation can't solve that, but we need to know something about it so that we know, oh, here's what our city council can do, and here's what our city council can't necessarily do. I think, on a final point here, I think, too, that congregations shouldn't try to solve everything, and that we should try to solve things that can fit with who we are as a congregation. In another congregation I was with, we started a Head Start classroom in our building because we had a spare room in the church, and that just fit with the DNA of the congregation. We'd had a day school that was part of the congregation for over 50 years. And, early childhood education is just something that we did. And we found in our city that there was a gap, especially in certain demographics, and this was something we could do. It was something that really fit within the kind of sense of calling that our congregation had, and I think that's really important too. I mean, congregations can't do everything, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do something. Yeah, so we should do the research about what's going on, and then as a way of figuring out where can we love our neighbors best in this community, and then we should love our neighbors in ways that fit with who we are as a congregation.
Can you get into some practicals of organizing a church community, of what that looks like? You look at the early church, there's like, hey, we have problems with widows and orphans, so we need to set up some people that will be in charge of widows and orphans to help care for the vulnerable in our community. So they were able to organize in a place where we have some people were focused on church planting or moving out the congregation into new spaces. We have some people that are caring for the widows and the orphans. How do we practically organize our churches and in a way that we can be interdependent with one another? I think a lot of times when we have specific ministries within a church community, they're all jockeying for power and for resources and finances, and not realizing how we all are interconnected and that we need one another for it to be holistic and whole. And it's not really just about your own little ministry over here. How can we organize? What does it look like practically? And what does it look like to keep interdependence well?
Yeah, I'm going to sound like a broken record in saying it, starts in the congregational politics, but I do think it actually starts in the simplest things in a congregation in terms of how do we build that politics of interdependence where it's not my ministry versus your ministry or anything like that. I mean, it starts in the really ordinary things like, how do you set up a church board meeting? And, meetings are some of the most, boring, but also fundamental parts of church ministry, and they're political. Meetings are political. So how you set up the meeting actually can have a really profound effect on whether people are jockeying for position or not. It's really common in my own denomination to organize meetings based on Robert's rules, and it's very formal and all this sort of stuff, and it has a place. Like I'm not anti Robert's rules by any stretch of the imagination, but there have been plenty of occasions in my own denomination where people manipulate Robert's rules to divide people from one another and to, make us mimic the partisan politics rather than build interdependence. I mean, Robert's rules was based out of, rules for the Congress, and, it was based on partisan politics, right? And it's, again, not to say we should never use them, but they shouldn't be the main tool in our workshop for having meetings. So, when you have a church board meeting, what would it look like to set up a meeting where the people who have different visions of, whether it's outreach or something else, have to actually listen to each other and have to sit across from one another and actually share with each other what are the values that are informing why I care so much about this ministry, and how do those values spring from my own sense of what the Spirit is telling me I should be doing in the world. So much of church politics is really about simple things like teamwork and listening to one another, and then truly listening, being attentive, seeing how the Spirit is really manifesting through this person that might just drive you crazy. and recognizing that, yeah, we do still share something. So I think it actually starts there in some of those like internal church meetings, and whether it's a board meeting or in many congregations I've been in, there's some kind of outreach committee, and yeah, sometimes it's sort of like, yeah, how do I get the most of the pieces of pie that are limited in this congregational budget? I think you just have to set the meeting up differently in a way that enables people to see one another, and that's the beginning. And it's from there that you then have the, again, difficult conversations about, look, the church budget's only so big. There are only so many things that we can support. But if you've built the interdependence on the front end, then those hard conversations about budgets are going to be a lot easier.
So how do we see one another? How do we listen well? What does it look like to actually have grace for each other? And then how does that then impact the way that we live in the world?
I think that it, again, starts with our interdependence, that we have to see how deeply interconnected our lives are with each other. One of the things that is hard about serving on a church board, or, I teach in a seminary now, so, being in a faculty meeting is recognizing that, this person that I disagree with is actually a part of my own life, that my life is deeply interconnected with their life. I talk early in the book about how the book was really influenced by me living in East Africa for a number of years between college and seminary. And, I quote folks like Desmond Tutu in the book who have a really profound understanding of how connected our lives are to each other. And it's not a value that American Christianity holds as easily as Christianities in many other parts of the world, but it's just one of those areas where we can so learn from each other that, it's a spiritual practice, right? It's a spiritual practice to, kind of keep watch over my own spirit in situations of conflict, and have care and compassion for this other person that I really disagree with. But also to say that, like, look, my life's actually interconnected with theirs. Because, it's not just, and I don't just mean that in a sort of ethereal sense. Like, if I've had a conflict with somebody in my congregation, like, that conflict's not just it didn't just happen as an event. The conflict is actually somehow like in my own psyche now. Like, that person and this interaction we have is actually now a part of me. It's like in my own mind and spirit now. And so I actually am interconnected with them. I think if we really sit down and, carry out those spiritual practices of self-examination, we see that, my enemies actually are, and the things they've done to me have inflicted my spirit, and they are actually a part of me. So the negative part of that, of course, is that, my spirit is hurting. The positive side of that is that my life's actually connected to that person now. My spirit is connected to that person now. And the Holy Spirit would ask me, with the gift of grace, to recognize an interdependence and to forgive this other person if they've harmed me. And that act of forgiveness is, again, a recognition of our interdependence, that person has already become a part of my life. So don't try to ignore it. Just recognize that we're interdependent with them, and forgive and share love. I think that's where it starts, is in that recognition that I am not, as much as, growing up in the United States has tried to persuade me that I'm just, somebody who pulls myself up by my own bootstraps and carries on with life. That's just, one, not how our minds and psychologies work, but two, that's not what Jesus ever wanted for us. Jesus calls us to be branches in a vine that's interconnected with other people, to use imagery in John, right?
So then what is the spirituality of church politics here, and how does our interconnectedness revolve around discipleship and formation towards embodying Jesus, looking like him as a community?
Yeah, it's another big theme of this book, that politics is actually a spiritual practice. And that can be kind of surprising, I think, because we often imagine politics as, this area where we're, fighting with each other and, conflict and strife. And, spiritual practice is this place of serenity and calm and, us connecting with the Spirit and growing closer to God. But, the truth of the matter is that congregations have spiritualities. Every community, in a sense, has a spirituality, has spiritual practice. We never live the spiritual life on our own. Our spiritual life is always connected with others. And so it's more a matter of how can we recognize the spiritual aspects of our congregational life, and how can we shape a politics that nurtures the spirit of the spiritual life of our congregations. So there's that kind of connection. Like, we never live the spiritual life on our own. And so in a certain sense, the spiritual life has to be political. And so again, it comes back to cultivating communal practices as a congregation that recognize that, back to church meetings, every church meeting is a spiritual practice, whether we like it or not. But every church meeting is a spiritual practice. And how can we organize that church meeting in a way that builds our interdependence, in a way that helps us see that our lives are interconnected with each other in profoundly spiritual ways? I mean, when you look at something like the civil rights movement in the United States, we often see it as a political movement. That was a profoundly spiritual movement as well. I mean, in so many of the speeches of Martin King and so many others, you just see that spiritual life and political engagement are part of this singular whole. It's not that the Holy Spirit is telling us, okay, you go to your prayer closet and do your thing there, and then you go into like the political world and that's a completely different realm. No, I mean, you get that in the civil rights movement. And I think it's a profound example for Christians today of the potential and the power of recognizing the connection between our spiritual life and our politics. It's also an example of, I think, a counterexample, I should say, to a lot of politics today, where it feels like, what we do in our prayer closet is something completely separate from what we do in public. That these are just realms that don't even talk to each other. And that I think that's a real challenge that we're facing in our body politic today. But again, it's a challenge that we can start to respond to by really integrating the spiritual and the political.
I think that's a good example. I think earlier at the beginning, you talked about politics and these concentric circles and moving from the bottom up. a lot of times we think that we want to, just change whatever the top concentric circle is, that behavior. Whenever I do some teaching around even cross-cultural work, it's actually about changing things from the inside out. And we can't just say, hey, your behavior is bad, change your behavior. They're going to go back to that behavior. It's changing inside out. How I think the civil rights movement was a really good example of grassroots, bottom up, making a significant impact and change in national politics by starting with something that is local, and some of it was even just congregational of politics, and saying, let's move, have the Spirit move into this space. Is there another good example how we could actually take grassroots, our politics, infused with the Spirit of God, so that we could actually see justice take place at a national or even international level? How does that work?
Yeah. First, let me say one last thing about the civil rights movement that you touched on, how local it was. It's really easy for us to sort of think back at, the March on Washington and all these things and say, okay, yeah, this was this big national thing. But the truth of the matter is that it was based in congregations oftentimes, and people are organizing in church basements, and people have been doing this work for often decades. And then it sort of gets this propulsion in the 50s and 60s, right? But people were doing this for a really long time. I mean, the two cities where I lived most of my life, Richmond, Virginia is where I grew up, and Alexandria, Virginia is where I live now. Each had these examples of civil rights-like activity that wasn't happening in the 50s and 60s, but was happening decades before. So in Richmond, there was a streetcar boycott in the early 1900s, led by John Mitchell and Maggie Walker. And they were trying to get streetcars unsegregated. And so there was this big boycott. And it was all the sort of same things that you see in the Montgomery bus boycott years later. In Alexandria, there was one public library in our city, and it was a whites only library, and for Black men in the late 30s, early 40s, staged a sit-in in that library. These same techniques that you see come up decades later, but they had been honed and practiced, and sometimes they worked and sometimes they didn't. In Alexandria, there was the sort of, quote unquote compromise was, let's build a blacks only library, which was a fraction of the size. And in Richmond, there was initial success actually with the streetcar boycott, but then then things moved backward with a new Virginia Constitution that basically hardened Jim Crow laws. And what I think that reminds us is that local action, when it seems like things might actually be getting worse, and that's what it looked like in Richmond, right? Could be planting seeds for something really profound that happens down the road. And we might not know that at the time. Well, there's no way we could know that at the time, right? Other than in a kind of, eschatological, hopeful sense. But in terms of what we see around us, we won't know it at the time. But we can find that reassurance in the fact that we are planting seeds for things that can change down the road. Now, to your other question, what does that look like today? Are there examples today of, folks doing this kind of local action? I've talked about housing a lot already, but, I think that is a good example. There's congregations all over the country that are, refitting their space to build affordable housing. There's a congregation just less than a mile from where I'm sitting right now that they were rebuilding their church, and they built somewhere around 150 affordable housing units on top of the church when they rebuilt it. And, things like that are sort of happening all over the country. It's not going to look the same everywhere, but, these are areas where, ordinary small action just starts to build momentum, right? And we are seeing more and more conversation in our national life about the housing crisis that we're in, and how difficult it is, and what are the things that are propelling this crisis, and what can we do to respond. I mean, that conversation is completely different now than it was 10 years ago. And a lot of that is because of congregations doing really creative and innovative things.
It's good. Well, Ross, if you had a hope for your readers here, good news of church politics, what would you hope that they would get out of this book?
I hope that they would read the book and reorganize their own congregational politics and see afresh that simple commandment, love your neighbor, and see that that is a profoundly political commandment, because Jesus is asking us to love neighbors. He's asking us to love neighborhoods. He's asking us to love cities. And he's asking us to care for people who suffer. And finally, that they would see that politics is a spiritual practice, and that our own spiritual life is never just something that happens in the prayer closet, but something that involves the communities around us.
Yeah, that's really good. It's really good. I really enjoyed this book. And so I really want people to go out and get it, and then start to put things into practice and organize well around what does it look like to love God and love neighbor. And if we can do that well, I think that our churches will start to look different, which is good. But then our communities will start to look different. And because our communities start to look different, then it just goes up. And then those concentric circles of impacts actually happen. And it does go from the bottom up. It is grassroots. That's really good. Ross, a couple questions I have at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Oh my goodness, that's a good question. Yeah, that 21-year-old self was just finishing college, on his way to working in East Africa. I think I'd say, after you have a really profound experience, which I did in East Africa, know that there could be a profound spiritual uncertainty afterwards, and know that the Holy Spirit's with you amid the highs and amid the lows of whatever your spiritual life and vocation look like, and that it does come together. Like, strands that seem odd come together. I mean, the fact that, like, I was working, I was an international relations major in college, and so I went and worked with churches in South Sudan. And then I came home and went to seminary and became a pastor. So I went from, like, the most international to the most local. And there was actually a deep synthesis there that the Spirit was, like, slowly building over time. But it wasn't without some, difficulty and spiritual struggle along the way. But the Spirit was doing what the Spirit does.
Yeah.
Right? Bringing new life.
Yeah. Good. Anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
There's a couple of books I'd recommend. One that really brought me up short as an American, white American, is a book by Mahmoud Mamdani, is his name. He's a political theorist. Don't worry, it's not too nerdy. I mean, it's an accessible. Let me put that differently. It's an accessible, nerdy book, but it's called Neither Settler Nor Native, and it's a book that really helped me think differently about my place as a white American citizen, and those who lived here in this country before I did and continue to live here, and has helped me recognize afresh the healing, another aspect of the healing that's needed in our country. I'm a big jazz buff, so there's a great new biography of the great tenor saxophonist named Sonny Rollins that I would recommend. Aidan Levy, I think, is the author. That's a great book. And this final one, this is a good book. Also a little nerdy, but worth it. It's by an ethicist named Karen Guth. And the book is called The Ethics of Tainted Legacies. The Ethics of Tainted Legacies. It's a book that responds to the ways that institutions and, including congregations, have had to reassess our history, especially after, racial reckonings of the last few years. I work in a seminary that was built with slave labor, and, buildings are named after the first, the founding bishop of the church, who was a proponent of slavery, but who also founded our school, right? That's a tainted legacy. And what Karen Guth does in that book that I found so helpful is that she shows, so this is not a new problem in Christian tradition, and we have lots of resources from our past that we can draw from. So for congregations and institutions that are going through those conversations, that's a terrific book I'd really recommend.
Those are great recommendations. And another one, how can people go out and get your book, Good News of Church Politics? And where would you like to point people to? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, the book's available at Amazon and at Bookshop. Those are I think, probably the best places to pick it up. You can check out my website, rosskane.com, which has recent publications and things like that. And I'm just launching a podcast called Love Your Neighbor. So check out that podcast. It'll be out just in the next couple of months.
Right.
I encourage you to give it a listen.
All right. So go out, listen to the podcast, Love Your Neighbor, go out, get the book, Good News of Church Politics, and check out rosskane.com with all those resources that he has. So Ross, thank you for this conversation. Thank you that we could actually see that there is some good news in church politics, and it's not just tongue in cheek. But there is the way that we organize ourselves could actually really have a profound impact on the way that we love our neighbors and love one another. And so that we could actually then see something incredibly fruitful happen, and we could see like spirit life happen within communities, that we could start to even make a dent in the housing crisis that we have right now, or in racism, things that are justice issues for us in our day and age, and that even these small seeds can make a big difference long term when we organize ourselves around love of neighbor and love of God. So thank you so much for this conversation.
It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.